Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm really, really delighted to be presenting and moderating this debate today. And what a wonderful moment to talk about this, because this is such a topical issue. It's become even more topical in the current situation we are in with the pandemic. So I'm going to introduce the panel, which is an amazing panel that we've got on. So I'm going to start with Jamie Saunders, who is a strategic security consultant and is visiting professor at the University College of London. And prior to this, Jamie worked in the UK government, so it's a long history working in cybersecurity. I'm delighted to introduce you to Alicja Cade, Chief Credit Suisse, and prior to this role, Alicja worked at PwC in the US and in the UK. And then Tal Mozes was CEO and co-founder of Mitiga, and is a serial cybersecurity entrepreneur, co-founder and CEO of Mitiga. So really, really pleased to moderate this panel this afternoon. And first of all, let me just say congratulations to CogX for putting together all this in this pandemic and to get us all to talk about very important issues at this time, although in a completely different way, which is the remotely. So, and I just want to start with this before I ask our panel. So just want to say a little bit of context and why I think it's important that we talk about all this. So first of all, when we started in 2020, before we got into this pandemic, one of the things that we were all saying is this year, 2020, is going to present a turning point, because when new technologies scale and come online, exacerbating secure cyber risks, affecting every business, government and individuals. We were having this discussion in early 2020. COVID happened, and with a increasing the level of risk to which organizations are now exposed, although as a recent Deloitte report that we issued a few days ago, we assess with confidence that the pandemic had not resulted into observable changes to threat actor tactics, techniques and procedures. But what has really changed for a lot of organizations that I talk to is the level of risk to which organizations are now exposed. So of course, with all this and with a wider scenario, including, for example, internet users increasing in emerging technologies, in emerging economies, with the and as internet users increase in emerging economies, then the same challenges of disinformation and cyber attacks that we experience in more cyber advanced countries will occur. With more data increasingly being collected, making policy attempts to protect data more urgent. What is clear is that successful business leaders are doing what they can to create a strong cybersecurity culture. But my question to the panel to start with is, cybersecurity is a global concern, and therefore, as such, it does need global solution. How do we approach this? What is the way forward? And with this sort of wider, bearing in mind the situation we're in with this pandemic, is it at all possible to create a global approach at this time? So I'm going to hand over to Jamie first and see what are your views on this.
Ivana, thanks very much. I think, yeah, we'll all agree that global collaboration is absolutely essential. What I want to focus on is how do we actually incentivize countries in particular to actually invest and take action on prosecuting and investigating cyber criminals. And the reason I say that is that while the risks to criminals of getting caught and punished is low, then, and vanishingly low in some jurisdictions, cybercrime isn't going to go away. The rewards are high, so cybercriminality will flourish. We're obviously going to have to carry on investing in cybersecurity, but unless there's genuine deterrence as part of our response, then the cybercrime will grow and grow. You mentioned I was in government. While I was at the National Crime Agency, I worked with a number of international partners to develop a three-pronged strategy to deal with cybercrime. the first foundational bit, which was about better protective security. But then we said we needed to be more aggressive against cyber criminals working in our own jurisdictions, and we needed to work more together against cybercrime groups operating overseas and those individuals running cybercrime as a services. Unless we disrupt them, we are not going to solve this problem. And in particular, how do we disrupt those working in what we called hard to reach jurisdictions, which I'll come back to in a second. And the key challenge that we faced, and which government continues to face, is how do you actually build that coalition with as many countries as possible who are both able and willing to tackle cybercrime. We did have a major focus on capacity building, in other words, helping countries to develop the internal capabilities they needed to tackle cybercrime challenges within their own jurisdictions and contribute to the wider effort. So capacity building is the major focus. But actually tackling cybercrime is not cheap and it's not easy. And there are countries who are unwilling to tackle cybercrime as a matter of national policy. Although for others, it's just a matter of competing priorities. So the question then is, how do we actually encourage countries to do more? And how do we persuade those countries who are simply disinterested in helping to reconsider their approach? I think there's some interesting parallels with other major security issues, such as aviation security or anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism and counter-proliferation. Because in each of those cases, the ability of a country or the companies within that country to participate in a collaborative endeavor, be that in transport or finance or general commerce, their ability to participate in those markets depends on their ability to demonstrate a certain standard in terms of preventing criminality, abuse, and achieving security. And if those countries don't meet those standards, then there are consequences, and those consequences are largely market-driven in terms of access to particular markets or friction when it comes to trade and so on. So my question for the CogX community is, how can we draw lessons from transport security, money laundering, etc., to actually create real economic incentives on countries to do their bit on cybercrime?
Thank you so much, and it's really interesting what you're saying, and I really hope that once the other panelists will engage with your questions as well, and also when we go to Q&A later. Alicja, what is your take on this?
So obviously, as a CISO, as a person on the ground and actually trying to make sure we protect the assets of our clients, protect the assets of the bank, I definitely see the connection with what Jamie has outlined from the global perspective, government perspective, and the financial services in particular sector is really understanding the global nature of the cyber risk. And all the CISOs in my peer organizations, we collaborate extensively through industry alliances, and also going beyond the industry. We actually, especially in the United States, we very much engage across the critical sectors. And I think Jamie is right that there has to be more effort in terms of encouraging combat of the crime at the global level. From our perspective, this would definitely pay off, because on the other hand, what do we have in terms of counterbalance here is an amazingly complex regulatory landscape when it comes to cyber. Every country has more than one regulator on average, that and in the United States perspective, you have state regulators and you have also federal regulators and product regulators. Amazingly complex melangerie of rules and demands. And for years, what we have seen is, I would say, lack of alignment between the regulators, not only within certain country jurisdictions, but actually globally. which actually diverts an awful amount of first-line support effort in order to tackle the dialogue with the regulators, but also to live up to very often kind of contradicting rules. It's very often to draw a common denominator. And as a global organization, you have to, because your control environment has to effectively operate on a global basis, because that's your operating reality. I think there is some progress being made amongst the regulators. Everybody is really looking at NIST's cybersecurity framework. This was very kind of focused in America lately. But over the last couple of years, I think NIST is gaining traction across the globe. And to be honest, it doesn't matter what guidelines, because all of them somehow map to each other. But what we really advocate for is a common voice amongst the regulators. In the United States, it's very much industry driven. We have really pushed for financial sector profile, which actually bases off NIST and adds some additional governance and third-party categories. And we're seeing traction of that adoption even in Europe. So that's a good side. But also what would help us is, apart from what Jamie has mentioned, which is the combating the crime, let's say globally, and more focus on the punishment and consequences, it would be also more demands, like we have demands on us to run secure organizations, on creating secure products by the suppliers. We, as you know, we have reliance on a lot of big companies, smaller fintechs as well, and really what we're asking for is that those products have a label that say this is secure and this is maintained in a secured way. And some operators do recognize that and drive it, but it would be great if we all globally recognize that. And it's not only for the corporates. I think for the likes of myself as a user, my family and your families and friends who are online, that would really, really pay off.
Alicja, it's really interesting what you're saying about the labels, which is a little bit like, something that, similar to what happens in the food industry.
The food industry, exactly. I must say, I moved from the UK to the US.
Yeah.
The labels on food aren't that good here.
Yeah.
But it's exactly what we want to say. What does it do and how does it do it and how secure it is? And what do we do to keep it secure? Because obviously, as we all know, this is an ongoing fight.
Would you envisage be the sort of body that doing the sort of defining what due diligence looks like?
I would envisage, well, it has to be, all the products we use have got a global reach, right? This is where I'm really strongly advocating for the global standards and a global recognition. And even if there's one standard in one country and another, they have to align. There has to be the minimum that's common denominator. And I would be looking for that kind of global recognition. Of course, some countries like Switzerland and Germany, we know, very particular in terms of data privacy and etc. They might have a higher denominator, but the basis should be aligned with the global guidelines.
Thank you. Tal, over to you.
Thank you. So I think the problem that we're discussing is pretty obvious, but define exactly what's also obvious about it is there is a war and we're losing it. And the war is between us and the cyber criminals, and sometimes cyber terrorists, and sometimes cyber warfare. And it's very hard to tell the difference. A lot of the times, terror organizations will commit crime to sponsor their activities, and they really have no borders. So the cybercrime can act in one country, and the terror organization can act in another. So we need to have a change in the state of mind, and to understand that it's a global problem and it's everybody's problem, talking about incentive, as Jamie has mentioned. And I understand all the valid points that Alicja has mentioned about regulatory and different regulations and the complexity of dealing with all of those. And it's all very, very true. And one of the things that we can do to face it is to do different cooperations. And I think we need to differ between cooperations of industries and cooperations between countries, states, and governments. When we're talking about industries, we already see different certs happening in different countries for industry, but we don't see amazing collaboration between them. We see some email exchange. There's no network. There's no real technology or platform behind that. And it's kind of funny that in our age, certs around the world are using email to exchange information. So I think a collaboration platform is probably a must. And I think a lot of the financial institutes already got a bit smart about it and decided that a lot of the information is non-competitive and then can share it. Exactly like KYC, know your customer. There's a lot of information which is non-competitive and can help each other. And the incentive is that if I'm contributing information, I can enjoy others' information as well. One of the main challenges, though, of sharing information, especially between countries and governments, is that sometimes the fact that I have a certain intelligence can compromise my source. And I wouldn't like to do that, because I would like to have, as a country, some supremacy of intelligence. So how do I share my intelligence without compromising my source is a challenge that needs to be solved. And the countries can act as a buffer between the private and the public sector globally. The other thing I think which is very important to discuss is how do we create a common language between different countries and different industries. We have a lot of organizations which are pretty mature, like MITRE, NIST, STIX, if you may, and so on. But it's not defined which one we're all using to share information between us. So there's a lot of steps that could be done before we even understand on the regulatory aspect what could be shared and what not, just to prepare the infrastructure for that.
Thank you. That's really, really, really interesting. And I do like the fact that you are talking about what can be done besides on the regulatory side, but also sort of the what can happen at industry level, what can happen at state level. Jamie, I want to bring you in on this. What is your having listened to Tal, what would be your approach and your thoughts on this? What he said?
Well, I actually take some encouragement from what Tal says, because it does remind us that, you know, despite all the problems, people are busy working together. There has been actually a huge amount of progress over the last few years, but I think there are still some gaps. So, for example, we do have a perfectly good model law for cybercrime legislation in the Budapest Convention.
Oh.
But there's still quite a few countries that feel reluctant to sign up for that for predominantly political reasons rather than practical reasons. And that does inhibit the ability to share some of the more sensitive data types that Tal's outlining. I think similarly, there's been some good work. For example, ICANN have a body that looks at good security principles for domain name registration. And there's been some good progress on dealing with domain name abuse in that. But there's still, you know, parts of the world and parts of the domain name system which are frankly more trustworthy than others. I think for me that the biggest gap is that, you know, co-opetition, or, you know, this sharing of, you know, expecting companies to share data because it's the right thing to do only goes so far. At the moment, the consequences of not sharing are pretty limited. I mean, I understand, for example, in some of the big information sharing networks that exist, it's only a small percentage who are producers rather than consumers of data. So what I don't see, which we do see for things like KYC, for example, is consequences for companies that don't share that sort of information. The only area I can see this working is around data protection, where concepts such as adequacy are quite useful. I think it's much easier to get contracts and to share data if you can demonstrate that your country has a robust data protection regime. I think that's one of the benefits of GDPR and predecessors. But what about other aspects of cybersecurity? The one that, you know, the call celebra I often go on about is BPC 38, I think it's called, which is IP address validation. It's a bit technical, but the bottom line is that if you have better IP address validation, there's a lot of DDoS problems that you can deal with. But there's very little incentives on telcos to actually implement this protocol, which has been around for several years, because it's all cost and all the benefits are not to you but to your peer telcos. So it seems to me at a very minimum there should be an expectation that individual countries are putting in place DDoS mitigations and having some good hygiene around their domain registry system. And if they don't, there ought to be friction introduced in the same way it's hard to get correspondence banking agreements if you're on the FATF blacklist. So I think there's more we need to do to get a bit harder nosed about this stuff.
Yeah, Alicia, I want to bring you in because on this, because one of the things that we always talk about is the cooperation between sectors, between private sector, and I just wanted to I mean, take following on from what Jamie was saying, what's your, as a CISO, what's your approach to this?
We definitely appreciate that collaboration, and I must say, in my own, let's say, area in the United States, we work closely via organization called FISIC, FFSCC, with actually Department of Treasury, and this is where we do get the first-hand information from Department of Treasury, from CISA as well. And not only that, it brings all the banks together, American banks, international banks, and we do exchange information. And we also work, and that also happens through FSI-SACS, of course. But apart from being it a great kind of collaboration and learning platform, I think this is what's very important for us. It's ability to influence the regulatory world too. So it's absolutely key. I wish that all organizations were kind of contributing into that in the same way, all institutions who participate, because you do have some banks and probably other institutions as well from critical infrastructure that perhaps like to take a back seat, but actually, regardless of the size, we all have to be in it in the same way, because let's say I would say it's no secret that smaller institutions might struggle with some of the control environment, strengthening it. And I think bringing those issues to the forefront, challenges, it will encourage the overall better cybersecurity environment. Interesting point, Jamie, when you were talking about the encouragement of kind of checks on the global level, I kind of thought, do we need United Nations of cyber here? Because I do feel that there is a lacking common voice amongst the countries, and I just wonder whether some organization like that would be able to enforce it. At the moment, we're very much talking about government, private, public sector, etc. But where do we bring it together?
Jamie, do we need a United Nations cyber?
Well, yeah, it depends what you think of the effectiveness of the United Nations. I mean, I've sat in a few. Yeah, exactly. No, I don't want to be political, but it does take quite a long time to get anything done in that environment. Yeah. And I think, the best mustn't be the enemy of the good. And I think, I think peer pressure between institutions is helpful. But Ivana, can I ask Alicia a slightly different question?
Yeah.
It's back to your point about regulators and regulatory collaboration, because the sense that I get is that most regulators are using the same script, but for an international bank like Credit Suisse, presumably you have to do what FINMA asks you to do in Switzerland, and then you have to do almost an identical thing in New York and London and Singapore and Hong Kong and so on. Are you finding that you're having to do the same thing several times because regulators aren't willing to have mutual recognition of, say, the tests or the assessments that they've done from one jurisdiction to another?
Yes. So I would say they work to the common script to a certain extent. Okay, and you will see that some regulators are actually very prescriptive in the controls they demand. And I would call out, for example, some of the original versions, let's say initial versions of NYDFS regulation in the States. Now we have MAS 635 as well, fairly prescriptive. And I think, yeah, there is certain kind of commonality and we find repeating ourselves, but to a certain extent, we need to really make sure that some of those regional, let's say, demands are still built into our global framework of controls, because it's not a risk-based view that the regulators take when they write those regulations. It's very prescriptive, and that's where the trouble begins.
Yeah.
I think the sound risk management should be the basis for all the regulations, and then depending on your risk profile, these are the most appropriate controls or not. Otherwise, the controls aren't optimized. You run into huge costs, and actually you end up running a control on a pretty much global extent that perhaps you otherwise you wouldn't have to, unless you pursue the holy grail of network segmentation, which, of course, as we all know, it's quite difficult and costly as well. So I do think that's the challenge. Actually, even now, I will kind of share with you some thoughts about the operational resilience. A lot of regulators talk, and so that's more broader than cyber. Cyber, for me, there's cyber resilience is a wedge, let's say, a part of operational resilience. A lot of regulators are saying to organizations, this is our focus point. You really need to work on it. We had that in the United States from Federal Reserve. Also, we're hearing that, of course, in the UK as well. And FINMA as well is talking to the organizations in Switzerland. But none of those regulators, and of course, when you take a global institution like the bank or any other global company, the resilience is a global issue. You cannot just make, let's say, couple of branches resilient. It just isn't going to work, and you can't just do it resilient from a cyber perspective. There has to be the business process around it assessed as well, because frankly, cyber, yes, could have a big impact, but so could change that goes rogue and wrong. So it's a much broader issue than cyber, and yet none of the regulators, apart from UK regulators, are coming out actually with some pragmatic definitions and understanding what they would recognize to be the essence of operational stroke cyber resilience. I think everybody is leaning towards the UK white papers because there's nothing else there. From the other regulators. And I think it's a situation when the regulators are looking actually at the industry and saying, tell us what the good looks like. So that collaboration, I think, of regulators and private sector is very, very important. But I think it has to be recognized that there is a need for that dialogue rather than coming in and raising demand, let's say, that nobody really knows what to work towards.
Tal, what are you making of this? What's your view?
I totally agree with that. I think that the threat landscape has totally changed in the last recent years because of different governments and agencies leaking their cyber weaponry, cyber capabilities to the public. And today, for organizational crime to weaponize themselves against any organization, they have a very, very low cost, and it's very lucrative as everybody are going through a digital transformation. We have more and more digital assets, and for a very low cost kind of advanced attack, the cost of $1,000 or $2,000, we can gain a lot of money. So countries are not collaborating, and they're not taking responsibilities for those leak capabilities. And that creates a situation when the risk tolerance is untolerated anymore, and the gap is becoming exponentially bigger. And we're talking about operational resilience. It's not anymore about how well can we defend against attack. It's also how well can we bounce back from any sort of turbulence. And I think, for example, cloud technologies are bringing a lot of opportunities for resiliency. And we see a lot of adoption by old school organizations like financial institutes and others to be more resilient using private and public clouds. It's got a lot of advantages for security, but also a lot of disadvantages like lack of security. If you look at old school IT consultants, not all of them, but most of them, at least my generation, had many years of IT understanding before we learned security, and then we started to understand security as well. While cloud is rather new, you don't have tens of years in experience in cloud before you understand security, right? You're just kind of born into the cloud with security or without. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of stuff still we can learn, a lot of stuff and technologies that can be adopted to build this resiliency globally. Cloud is definitely a major player when we're talking about global scene. But the gaps are still big.
Yeah, I mean, I have a question to you all, and I mean, I've been thinking while you were speaking, I'm thinking, what is the impact of sort of new emergence technologies that are coming? You know, they're starting to experience the same issues they've been facing in the more sort of cyber advanced economies. Is there something? I mean, does it have any impact on sort of the global, on sort of cybersecurity as a global challenge? You think, Tal? What's your view?
So definitely, there's a big impact of, as mentioned, cloud computing or serverless computing is an obvious one. Distributed ledger is another way to mitigate some of the risks, but not really used well. More used as a buzzword than anything else at the moment. Supercomputers being born, giving a lot of advantages to a lot of organizations and countries. The risk landscape is changing and shifting on a day-to-day basis. And I don't think that our defense capabilities are changing at the same pace.
Yes. Jamie?
Well, I definitely agree with what Tal said. I mean, there's technology which is right here and now, and you know, things like cloud security, and I think a lot of institutions have put a lot of thought into that. But I think we also need to think about some of the longer term things and how we can get stuff right now. So for example, well, AI is here now, and you write all about that, Ivana, of course. But it seems to me we put a lot of effort into ethical principles for AI, and quite rightly so. But I haven't seen much work put into security by design principles for AI, and how do you protect the integrity of AI against attack? I think there's issues to do with IoT and 5G, not because we're not looking at 5G and IoT security, of course we are, but what that's going to lead to is a real entanglement in terms of new service models and a much more distributed and dispersed ecosystem, and much greater uncertainty about who's responsible for the end-to-end security of things. You know, a driverless car, or maybe a smart city is more obvious, or and there's a lot of issues around that. And I do think we need to start thinking about quantum computing. Tal mentioned the sort of supercomputers, but you know, they will be with us in the next 10 years. And we already know that a lot of cryptography is not going to be protected against that. Firms are beginning to think about that, are beginning to take action, and that's fine. But what about some of those distributed things, some of the way we're dealing with authentication, PKI, the blockchain, which are fundamentally dependent on cryptography, which is going to be horribly out of date in 10 years. And it's, to me, it's about collaboration. Who's actually going to lead the effort to anticipate these risks and ensure there's appropriate collective action to deal with them?
Alicia, what do you think?
I mean, definitely for any institution, the new technologies are an opportunity as well, right? So we're not gonna just sit back, say, not known about it. We are not gonna try. Everybody's gonna jump on it because digital world is out there, and frankly, our consumers are gonna be demanding that too. I do think, as from the CISO, let's say, perspective, and any security technologies, the new technologies are a huge opportunity to be able to digest a huge amount of intelligence and actually assess the risk in the more and more complex environment in a faster way, in a live way. So you're less reactive. You can really foresee what controls you need to strengthen. So that's something that definitely I'm excited about and look forward. But also to what Jamie was saying, this is where it becomes more complex, because suddenly your risk environment goes beyond your traditional organization remit. For example, like now we have with COVID, suddenly the banks aren't, and other institutions, for those who are working remotely, aren't limited to their traditional, let's say, physical environment. We are all working 90%, 95 to 100% remote. And that changes the game, let's say, how you assess your risk environment. And this is where I do think that what will help us, so coming from this one level of complexity and going into another of new technologies, new tools, is that kind of what I said earlier, the labeling, and actually some demand on minimum security standards, because otherwise it's impossible to embrace and assess the risk of all your environments, and you just have to then assume that nothing is secure and you have zero tolerance for that, which stops the progress, of course.
Yeah. Tal?
Yeah, I think the incentive could go to countries in terms of maybe a credit rate for the country or something like that, to give incentive to government to be a buffer for the different industries and take responsibilities for sharing information. But maybe I'm being a bit too naive about it, but I know when there is no real money incentive, nothing really will happen, and private organizations don't have the financial incentive to do so. But I think also, to Jane's point, there is a need for a global organization, but nobody knows who can take responsibility, and there will be different different organizations trying to control that. I don't think there will be a single organization to control them all. It'll be interesting to see what happened. And definitely a good point about AI or machine learning. It's a great technology that helps us, and of course everybody's adopting it. It's good to fight against cyber attacks. It's good for a lot of stuff, but also we use that for accelerating our business, and defending the algorithms should be #1 priority. The other thing that I see is that there's a lot of budget constraints with all organizations. So even if I have better technology and I can crunch numbers faster, I've got better computers, I don't always have all the information I need. So if I am in an organization using cloud technology, for example, I probably will not keep all the different logs that the technology enables me, because I'm paying for bandwidth, I'm paying for storage. So I'll keep the minimum possible, and to keep all the information I need to have the right intelligence for myself or to share will be very, very expensive, and I don't have good enough incentive to do so.
Yeah. Please.
Well, I just thought Tal said something quite important there when he talked about credit rating as an analogy. It does seem to me to get the right transparency around how is a company performing, or indeed how is a country performing against a set of criteria that represent a range of what good looks like, including is a company or a country doing its bit to support the global effort. And I do think, you know, a bright light is often the strongest incentive, and one can do that without getting political about it. It doesn't have to be a big sort of UN thing. It actually just means getting people out there, rather like the rating agencies do, I guess, with companies and indeed with countries, to get that sort of discipline in, so we can all see that, you know, Alicia's bank is doing really well at the moment, and then I think consumers and potential B2B partners will feel, yes, this is a better organization for me to work to, i.e. make security a business advantage and not just a cost. I do think the key is in there somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I agree. And I wonder whether, because we've got 5 minutes left, I wonder whether we could focus on one last topic, which is around education. Because one of the things that, cybersecurity is, we can agree, I think, we've been talking about sort of the need for widespread collaboration, the need for information sharing that has to happen at speed, the need of collaboration between actors and all this. The need to develop a common vision. But I do wonder whether we could talk a little bit about education, because, there has to be, in order for the world, for different actors to develop a common vision, then education must be quite a crucial part of it. I mean, Alicja, what do you think from your CISO sort of perspective? The understanding.
I think it's kind of CISO perspective and kind of broader from my career perspective so far. I do think that, and that's why I find it exciting. And I must admit, I came into the field by coincidence. Somehow my path veered like that. So I've seen the cybersecurity world evolve for years, right? And like Tal was saying, we all grew up in the IT kind of specialist environment, and now security became more and more pronounced, and that's how it goes. But what it means that there is so many elements in information security and not all of them are, I would say, technical, right? We do need technical specialists by all means, but we also need good policy writers. We need good behavioral analysts for insider threat, for example, analytics. We need people who can bring the business and the technology together. I very often say it's like being a jam in a sandwich. Right, the sandwich, the one layer is the technology, another layer is the business, and that's why I think the courses, let's say, that are out there with the universities and colleges, I think they need to operate bringing those two worlds together. I very recently, a couple of weeks ago, I had a very big privilege to judge a student competition on cyber simulation, and the team that won was the team that had an absolute mix of people from various backgrounds and degrees. And they were the people who brought the most comprehensive view of how the company should manage with the cyber scenario. And it was just the essence of what I'm saying here. So I always look, in terms of the fostering talent in my teams, is bringing a variety of backgrounds. Technical skills are something that can be learned. But again, that broader understanding of the business context, and again, that goes to resiliency, it can be just done on a technology level. And that encourages, I think, diversity as well, from kind of the broadest perspective, which we very much need.
Yeah, a couple of minutes each. Tal, Jamie, would you agree with this on education?
Go on, Jamie.
Well, absolutely. I think in terms of educating the specialist cybersecurity operators, of course, the other side of the coin is educating the wider workforce. And I think my worry is that a lot of that training tends to be very sort of compliance centric. Mm-hmm. And actually, there's more that one can do to engage the front line of the business in the actual risk assessment itself, because ultimately they're the ones carrying the risk. And I think if one it involves them more in identifying the risk, understanding the risk exposure, understanding the risks arising from their business practices or compliance issues, then the more likely they are to be brought in to the overall cybersecurity program and the important role that they play.
I think spot on. I think there is a misconception that cyber breaches are the problem of the CISO. When there is a big breach, it goes to the media. The share price will be determined by the media, not by the CISO or the IT team. It will go to the regulators, the privacy officer, legal firms will be involved, PR firms, the board of directors, everybody will be involved in that. We do a lot of tabletop exercise to gold teams, silver teams. And now we have to redo it all because of the work from home. Everything is different. But there's a thirst for education and knowledge. And I agree that it started with a regulation-driven a kind of education, but I see a lot of organizations just calling us, how do we deal with the crisis now when everybody's working from home? How do we deal with breaches? Who's calling whom is in charge, and so on. I think we're in a much better place than we were in 2019. That was called the year of cloud misconfiguration, maybe. Yeah.
Great. So I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much to join me. So I hope you can also join whether it's people watching us, join us for the Q&A, and I see you there. And it'll be a really interesting, continuing this really interesting debate, and with loads of questions, and I'll see you there.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.